Welcome to our lecture on A Room with a View. As we move into Module 2 and we shift from the written text to the actual film version of a novel in this case, we're going to need some information to ground ourselves to really understand the time period and the author as well. This lecture will create the foundation for us, and of course you can always come back to it as needed. This will be reinforced by our class time and all of the questions I hope you have. So we're leaving Shakespeare's world and we're moving into an incredible rendition of an Edwardian novel by a once independent film company called Merchant Ivory, who actually became an incredible film company, or they became an incredible film company. Merchant Ivory were a team of two men, one now passed, Ismail Merchant and James Ivory. James Ivory actually will write or has written the script for the last film we're going to do together. And this film that we're looking at is one of their first attempts at the big screen and bringing something historical, academic, literary, and artistic into the film world, creating a film version that could still be artistic, but could still reflect the period of the time with the integrity necessary. Forster was a quieter kind of writer. He certainly didn't have the personality or the oomph of James Joyce or Hemingway or Fitzgerald, if we think of some of the American writers. I discovered Forster when I was finishing up my undergraduate degree, and I was working a lot on the Victorians. My students always ask me, what's your favorite period? Sure, I love the 1890s. The fin de siècle for me is really fun, as we'll talk about a little bit today, as your module will show you as well. And please don't forget, your module reinforces the historical, biographical, and contextual ideas that we'll work with throughout the term, and I'll assign various pages to read as we start classes to ground ourselves for what we're going to talk about, what we're going to see, and then of course what we're going to talk about after we screen. Forster was born in 1879, so he was a college student, a university student at Cambridge by the end of the 1800s, as Queen Victoria became old and frail and would soon pass. He was at Cambridge where in many ways he was liberated from the silence that affected him in the equivalent of what we would call high school. He grew up in a privileged reality where his father died when he was within the first year of his existence, leaving himself and his mom trust funds of sorts. When we think of Forster, we have to position Forster as a writer. Forster was a humanist. His socio-political activism throughout the wars and during his time in India as well, where empire was really a problem, right, to put it in a very mild way. And he seriously sided, empathized, and supported the Indian cause for liberation from the British Empire. Forster was out and out a humanist. By the time he started to write what's known as his Italian novels, two of his novels separated by another one during the early 20th century, Forster was coming into his own. Cambridge allowed him to understand himself as different. He was initiated into a group of intellectual young aesthetes, as they were called the Apostles. And think about the Apostles, as Jesus' disciples in some ways. It's a little amusing and also a little, it's a little special. The Apostles were by and large what we would understand today as queer men. They might have married, they might have dated women, but they had a special fondness and bonding of men with men during this period of time. One Victorian scholar, Richard de la Mora, who I think is incredible, wrote a book called The Sexual Politics of Victorian Aestheticism, and it's here he really opens up this kind of almost secret society. There was a line to be drawn within the Apostles that to interact with other men, to talk about and I quote, "The unspeakable vice of the Greeks was one thing, but to act upon it would be another." And Forster really articulates this in his 1913-14 novel, Morris, which he didn't publish at all during his lifetime. He showed friends, but he felt it became outdated by the time he could publish it. And the wonderful thing about Forster, to the scholars who came before me and the professors I had, is that when he died as a rather old man, he lived a very long and full life and died in 1970, and he left a repository filled with writing. For anybody who does academic research, this is heaven. This is a gold mine. And Ivory Merchant were aware of this as well. All of Forster's manuscripts were published. So I know when I was doing research on A Room with a View as a young graduate student, I had access to the different drafts of A Room with a View. And as we're going to look at in a bit, A Room with a View was a project. It took him a while to get out. So let me move back to Forster, the humanist, and Forster's emphasis on human connection, something he really brings to full head in the 1910 and 11 effort, Howard's End, arguably his last published Edwardian novel. And there's a need for Forster with his characters to connect not just the human heart, but also the human soul. In other words, it's a very late 19th century and thus Edwardian, right? It even transgresses what was the Victorian Empire into the early 20th century way of seeing this union of people that remain devoid of the physical per se, but we'll definitely see that as it progresses throughout his novels. Morris really encapsulates this. A Room with a View doesn't. And we'll look at the ending of the novel when we get there. Certainly not right now, when you get to the end of the film, that is. How do we understand the 1890s? If we think about Victorian Empire and Victorian domesticity and Victorian tradition and Victorian social convention, and this very organized society based upon empire. Empire would have been, of course, the capitalism of the time, where European nations posited themselves into what they understood as lesser countries and colonized them. You could think about the factories that we have in China and India, as well as many other places around the world that we have no idea of as Westerners. We've never been in there, but our clothing always says tags. It's saying made in these countries that we would understand as developing. And think about the conditions of the people working there. Capitalism, as a side remark, is not any, it's different than colonialism for sure, as there's no slave trade per se, but it definitely has its problems and it definitely isn't fair, to say the least. Back on track, by the 1890s, England was prosperous. Queen Victoria's England was a very effective nation. But the writers and the thinkers and the artists of the time started to rebel as they wanted to, or as they could, to the status quo of the time, to what's understood as social convention. If we look at the 1890s, despite the 1885 Act that made homosexuality illegal and punishable by hard labor or death, something which was not changed in England until 1867, the 1890s were decadent. There was a thriving subculture in London, and this subculture included sex, drugs, prostitution, homosexuality. And you can certainly look at the college libraries and see what you can find, and you'll be rather surprised. When we look at the artistic movements and the way that the artists of the time, the writers of the time thought, and we think to Oscar Wilde and his claim to fame in the 1890s, 1895, the importance of being earnest, which right after that led to the Oscar Wilde trials, and then Wilde dying penniless in Paris, a horrible existence after imprisonment, sadly. We think of what's understood as degeneration and pessimism. This is where a particular level of wit, and a biting wit, is used by different writers to expose the social conventions and the senselessness that would have existed within the conventions exposed in a given text. In other words, there remained a rather sad critique of the Victorian world. Not the execution of the critique is sad, but the Victorian world itself to these writers embodied a certain level of sadness. And many of them left to Paris, to New York, to Italy, especially during the early 20th century. Now, Forster graduated he stepped down, as it was called, he was done, at Cambridge in June of 1901. And the realities of the 1890s for sure shaped the way that he wrote, especially in the earlier texts. One can see the echoings of Walter Pater and as well Oscar Wilde in particular in the writings of Forster. He travels extensively for just over a year, if I'm not mistaken. It should be October 1901 to November of 1902, if I'm correct, right? And we could always turn to for Bagksy and Forster Life if we need these pieces of information. I do have them. But he traveled, and you might really appreciate this, with his mother. So imagine you all traveling after you graduate with one of your parents. I think some of you are probably very lucky and have really hip, amazing parents, but I know when I went to Europe after my undergraduate degree, I went with a good friend from my undergraduate degree, and we were very happy not to have our parents and not to have our phones, right? These things, this technology didn't exist. So we had a lot of freedom to make mistakes and learn, or to just move forward and learn. Forster traveled with his rather high maintenance English and very Victorian mother, Lily. And it was from his travels in Italy that his ideas that fostered the love that we see in Where Angels Fear to Tread, A Room with the View, and then the 1911 short story, Story of a Panic, certainly surfaced. In Forster's words, Forster explains that his characters transfigure. Think of transfigurement as its roots within Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Ovid, who told the classical myths, was as steadfast for classical studies and 19th century neoclassicism. So Forster wanted his characters to transfigure. And we really see this in the Italian novels. In other words, we want them to change, to move from A to B, to shift form, to liberate themselves from the shackles that hold them back. All of his characters are transformed. Save the Story of a Panic, which is a very strong homosexual subtext, Angels, 1903, and Where Angels Fear to Tread, I'll call it Angels, you'll notice that, and A Room with a View, which I'll refer to as Room, 1908, really reveal reflections of Forster's travels during the early 20th century and his ideas about what love could be and what could happen when one really lets go of one's, not so much inhibitions, but one's association to social convention in this overordered construction of society. Philip Hareton and his sister Harriet in Where Angels Fear to Tread seem very much like Forster and his mom. Lilia might reflect his voice as she leaves and ends up marrying a working class Italian. And Lucy in A Room with the View is for sure, once we read through the manuscripts, Forster's muse. Forster labored over the construction of Lucy. She really needed to be a vision of perfection to him. She needed to be a round character, in his words, a complete character, but she needed to embody, and she's a young character, right? She's roughly your age. She needed to embody what it would be like to transfigure, to leave the Edwardian world behind her and step into what true love could be. What does a muse mean? A muse, a sense of inspiration, a Tinkerbell of sorts, something that motivates a writer to keep writing. When we write, when we make films, when we write novels or stories or chapters of novels or plays, our characters bring us forward. We want them to develop, and they change and shift, and sometimes we trim them, and sometimes we let them grow a little more, we let them open up. But it's in my understanding that Forster posits his own desire into his characters, both male and female. Philip Hareton, for sure, could be understood as Forster. Philip even subtextually falls in love with Lilia, well, Lilia's husband, which is kind of amazing. And in other ways, Forster can posit his own voice into his female characters, as he does with Lucy. Lucy and Charlotte Bartlett, who are very comical renditions, do reflect probably some of the friction Forster experienced with his mom while traveling. A line from Where Angels Fear to Tread is actually used in the screenplay of A Room with a View. And if I'm not mistaken, it's Miss Lavish who is excited by Lucy, as she is in the novel version. But she steals a line from the narrator in Where Angels Fear to Tread, who posits himself in Philip Hareton's voice. And Miss Lavish says to Charlotte Bartlett, and there's someone else with them, and I'm not catching it. And you think after reading it a million times, or maybe she's only with Charlotte at this point. She might be. We're going to find out when we screen. And she says that Lucy should be transfigured. After all, it happened to the Goths. So think about the Goths, the Visigoths coming down, right? These marauders, these Huns, who are transfigured by classical society in Italy. And this is what Miss Lavish wants for Lucy. Miss Lavish is a novel writer in A Room with a View, and she actually ends up casting Lucy and possibly George as echoes within her novel. And you'll see this in the film, so I don't want to give away too many spoilers. Now, after this experience where Forster got to visit picture galleries, as they were called, museums, and was inspired by the art that he saw, and cathedrals by architectures and representations of biblical stories in art, he was moved, he was changed, and he returned to London as Queen Victoria was freshly dead, if one could say that, recently passed. And the death of Queen Victoria in early 1902 allows Forster to differentiate himself as this newly arrived Londoner from Italy. And he definitely differentiates himself from his Victorian past. He's in a new century. There's a new king. The world is becoming Edwardian by the time he has returned to London. What we understand as Edwardian opposed to Victorian is a shift within society of the time in England. King Edward, right, in your terms, a bit of a bad boy, a level of opulence, of extravagance that existed during his reign in the first roughly 10 years of the 20th century, halted by World War I, by the Great War that was supposed to end all wars. And it is from there, at the end of this war, that European society completely begins its restructuring. And then, of course, Second World War, et cetera, but we'll move back to our early 20th century to somewhat happier times before the World Wars. And what's important for us to realize is that Forster was in part trying to find a place for himself in this world, but also in part, based on his own sentiments, in conflict with this world. And by being in conflict with his world, he had the desire to make it different. He had a trust fund. He was writing. He wrote novels that gently pushed buttons. And he would eventually go on to teach at the Working Man's College, a night school of sorts, where people who came from a working class, not an upper working class, but an actual poorer working class, could educate themselves, could better themselves. Forster wanted to make a difference, and the Forrestrian mode, as it is referred to in scholarly work, is a kind of post-Jamesian mode. And if we think of the Victorian writer Henry James, we can think about the way James would set up what he wanted us to look at. And Forster and James do have similarities. From subtext to partial text, we see this in both writers. And it's like the tea table is set up for us, and we can decide which cup and which snack we feel like having and how we choose to digest the said tea and snack. This is what makes Forster's writing both delicate in some ways, but also rather politically correct, for lack of better words. That Forster wished to expose problems within the Edwardian world without stating that they were actual problems. And instead, obstacles, issues is that's the word we would coin now might be. And it's from here, it's from Forster's experience as a writer that Ivory Merchant took these manuscripts, that they took Forster's larger oeuvre and decided to make this incredible film version of A Room with a View.